our CEO and founder Yang was an environmental scientist. I'm a cognitive scientist before I was a chef. So all of it points towards like finding a good way to like asking curious, good questions, going ahead and testing it relentlessly, and also just finding the right metrics to gauge whether you were right in the first place, whether it was the right question to ask, or whether the answer is what you expected.
Welcome. This is Phil Michaels, Forbes 30 Under 30 entrepreneur and performance coach. Forbes names the top 30 entrepreneurs, leaders, and stars in the world. And each week, we bring you one of them to help you level up in your life and business. From celebrities like LeBron James to Kylie Jenner and Cardi B, you're sure to learn from the list. Thanks for spending time with me today. Now it's time to level up. Level up. Welcome to the Phil with Forbes 30 podcast. Today we have a very special guest. He made the Forbes USA list in 2020 for the food and drink category. He opened his first restaurant when he was 16 in an abandoned newspaper factory in his hometown of Hong Kong. Despite spending his time at Yale studying cognitive science and English, he spent his weekends running a restaurant out of his dorm room known as Why Pop Up. He then went on to cook at Michelin-starred kitchens in Hong Kong and New York before opening his current venture, Junzi Kitchen, which is a fast casual restaurant chain with the mission of updating the American understanding of Chinese cuisine. They now have over 4 locations in New York and New Haven and have raised over $5 million from investors, including the co-founder of P.F. Chang's and America's Queen of Chinese Food. Please welcome my very special guest, Lucas Sin.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
Very excited to have you here. I'm honored and such a pleasure to learn more about you, your story, and your new venture. So before we dive into things, where were you when you found out you made the Forbes list?
Probably in bed, because they usually drop that list first thing in the morning, right? They don't tell anybody about it, but probably in bed. I knew the editor, Chloe, because we had spoken. I'd sent her food. She'd come to the restaurant and that sort of thing. And we had a really good time chatting. And I remember stopping by the Forbes office on Fifth Ave and like sneaking in to drop food off for the judges and stuff. But I had totally forgotten about it when the list came out. And honestly, the best thing that happened with the list was that my parents were proud. There's this narrative for Chinese kids in the US, if you go to school, the whole point is that you don't make beef and broccoli 16 hours a day. Here I was doing that, and it was a good validation, at least for my parents, that we were doing the right thing.
Yeah, it's validating, and you're now getting to do that, but you have that stamp of approval from someone outside of just yourself.
Yeah.
Were you making the food for your parents before you got nominated?
Yeah, I mean, so my parents are in Hong Kong. I'm from Hong Kong all the way, and I had been cooking since I was quite young. I mean, as you mentioned, I had opened the restaurant when I was in high school. And the idea there was just to teach my friends how to cook, hold 3 plates at once, and like serve a bunch of people. It was scrappy and it was sort of like illegal, but it was very much the first time I had come across the idea of like trying to tell stories through food, right? That when you put food together, when you put a menu together, that menu can say something about who you are, what the food is like, what you think food should be, and all these things. And that's kind of what kickstarted a lot of this culinary career for me.
And how did you become inspired to do that? I mean, it's not every day that a 16-year-old's like thinking, how can I hold 3 plates on my hand and teach my friends about cooking?
I don't know if I'm reflective enough to give you a straight answer about how it came about, but I remember the conversation was in the car with my father, and my father was like, hey, this is your last summer here in Hong Kong before you go off to college, probably in the US. What do you want to do? And I was like, I don't know what I want to do. He said, if you like food, you should try to open a restaurant. Like if you wanted to, why wouldn't you open a restaurant? That was the main thing. Why not? So we did whatever we needed to do. Had no idea what we were doing. Bunch of kids playing restaurant, basically. But slowly but surely, you start to get a grasp of, what it means to actually serve food to people and how to do it, effectively and deliciously and safely and all these things. So that's kind of how it started. And I have to say that pop-up scrappy mentality is still a very big part of how we like to do things at Junzi now. And it's a huge sort of tool that we use to start testing out concepts and dishes and that sort of thing.
Very cool. And were your friends giving you a hard time about the food you were cooking for them at a young age?
I people tend to tell you that they like the food. There's always surprise like, oh, look, these 16-year-olds are putting together food, but it's restaurant quality. But there certainly was a huge learning curve. I mean, I worked at a lot of tough restaurants with really tough chefs. By the time I was pretty serious about being a part of the culinary industry, so there certainly was a learning curve then.
Yeah. What was that moment when you said, wow, this is actually something I enjoy doing? And what was that pivotal moment where you said, I'm not going to continue here? It doesn't have enough legs to continue with it. I'm going to move to the US.
Mhm.
Why didn't you just continue in Hong Kong at
Yeah.
that moment?
So there wasn't ever a pivotal moment when I said, you know what, I'm just going to become a chef. I've been always been excited about reading and going to school and being in school. So going to college was without a question, and I was very lucky enough to go to Yale. So, but while I was in school at Yale, we were also opening restaurants on the weekends in the dorms, in the basements, and I was spending every moment that I was in the classroom basically cooking for chefs and like be on people's like speed dial. Like this Italian restaurant, they would call me and be like, hey, I need you for service. It's Tuesday, come in. We're cooking for who was it that it was like Martha Stewart's, like whoever, and it's like they're in town, you got to come. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'll come help. And then so I was just always trying to be dialed in to the real life culinary industry despite being in school. I spent all my summers mostly in Japan and in Hong Kong and in Seattle, sort of just cooking for chefs, backpacking, just trying to learn a sense of cuisine. I was very dedicated to Japanese food. And I spent all of my summers sort of backpacking through Japanese restaurants and occasionally stopping in restaurants I liked, learning this cuisine and basically going up to the owners and saying, hey, I, I'd love to work for you. I love the way you cook your curry, for example, and I'd love to work for you for free. I'll scrub all your dishes, do all the floors, that sort of thing. Do whatever I need to do to spend a little bit of time here as a student. And I would just do that over and over and over again in whatever city I was in. And that's how I started getting really obsessed with kitchen culture, getting obsessed with the way people in kitchens are, and how much fun you could have just serving food to people and putting smiles on people's faces and stuff. So that's kind of it. All snowballed until the end of my until I graduated from school, and it was sort of like there is nothing to do but to continue cooking. There is, on one hand, I didn't feel a massive force compelling me to stay in the culinary industry. But on the other hand, I just didn't see another option. It just seemed necessary. So I met my co-founders at Junzi Kitchen, and then we started building the first restaurant. I joined a week after I graduated, and it's been almost 5 years, and we've been opening restaurants up and down the East Coast until now.
I'm looking forward to when you bring one down to the South in
Yeah.
Florida.
Yeah, I mean, Florida is a crazy place. It's got an amazing food scene. My personal interest, obviously I make Chinese food, but I'm also really interested in how Chinese food evolves in different sort of regions of America, because it's really easy to see Chinese food as one thing. To think of Chinese food as sweet and sour and egg rolls and fried rice and lo mein and stuff. But there's a lot of actually nuance to that type of Chinese American food. And I imagine with how diverse the sort of like cultural fabric of Tampa Bay, of Florida at the very least is, you might find some interesting sort of like Florida only regional Chinese American sort of dishes that I didn't know about. And that would be really fun to investigate.
I just went to my first hot pot in Tampa
Oh, cool.
recently, and
Was it
uh,
spicy?
I love it spicy. So I'm
Yeah.
kind of an outlier from the
Yeah.
American culture, I guess you could say. But you hit it spot on. I think a lot of Americans have this indoctrination of what Chinese food means to them, and they
Mhm.
picture the little white
Right.
cardboard box, and they get the takeout. And
Mhm.
I always looked at that food as it's poor quality ingredients with
Mhm.
just covered in great sauces, and
Mhm.
they're
Yeah.
addicting to the point where Americans love it. But there's another side of Chinese cuisine, if you go with the right people, that will expose you
Mhm.
to a higher level of standards that it
Mhm.
sounds like you and your team have really set forth, and you're trying to
Mhm.
expose more Americans to this idea.
Yeah. I mean, the cool thing about Chinese American food, and we can come back to this because, so an update since that bio was written and since last year, the Forbes list, is that we've sort of launched a new concept called Nice Day Chinese. And Nice Day Chinese is our attempt to look at what Chinese American food really means. So I like to think of Chinese American food not as a lesser or older version of, authentic Chinese food that is newer to this country, but I like to think of Chinese American food as a regional Chinese cuisine. It's important to understand that when people say Chinese food to me, it's kind of like me saying European food. It's so diverse. It's massive, right? It's like 50 something ethnic minorities. It's at least 25, provinces or states or regions. And there are limitless ways to categorize the different parts of Chinese cuisine. And if you think of Chinese cuisine as this sort of like big monolith that's built up of smaller regions, you can think of a lot of Chinese cuisine outside of the borders of China, like Chinese American cuisine, as a region. And so when you look at it as a region, and then you start to realize that it's actually really cool because Chinese American food is very authentic, right? It's very much a cuisine that was invented in the US by Chinese immigrants as a means of survival, right? As a means of entrepreneurship. It's one of the most efficient restaurant systems in the world because your food almost always gets to you super hot, right? They were one of the first people to start delivering without dining rooms, which is a fancy way of saying, the fancy way of which to say is to call it a ghost kitchen, right? Like all these technologies, or at least sort of like business models and operations models, can be found in these Chinese American restaurants that you can't even find in what people call Chinese restaurants in China, right? So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there that I'm really excited about and really interested in looking into. On the other hand, there is a different wave of Chinese food in the US that is carried by new immigrants. And that's kind of how I'd like to explain how Junzi Kitchen came about, right? So imagine this: all the co-founders at Junzi were students. They went to the best schools in China, and then they go to the best schools in the US, and they're very, very intelligent, and they find themselves compelled to sort of make a impact and show people that, hey, my story can be told through food, and this food is worth eating because it's delicious, it's fresh, it is what you would like to eat if you're working in an office for lunch, and it should fit the way we all eat today. It just needs to be modernized. And that type of cuisine, in our case, it's very home style, vegetable forward, noodle bowls and rice bowls that we serve at Junzi. That type of cooking is a new type of in a sense, a new type of Chinese American cuisine, because it's still invented in America, right? It's still made in America. It's derivative of our experiences and our authentic memories of China, but it sort of is just updated to new sort of standards of how people like.
It's like a modern, healthier version of it,
right.
Sounds like.
Yeah. And I would like to say that it's no more authentic than the Chinese American stuff, right? It's no our what do we have? We have a firecracker chicken and lion's head meatball. Those dishes are no more authentic than General's House chicken and chicken lo mein. But they can exist in parallel, and both of them could be sort of exciting and interesting for people depending on what their context for eating the food is.
Yeah, and talking about bringing the food hot and how efficient the Chinese cuisine is in Chinese cooking, it reminds me of hot pot, because hot pot, you're basically cooking it yourself right in front of you.
Yeah. I mean, Chinese food is really, really, they really, really care about texture and temperature because a lot of flavors that are prominent in Chinese cooking are more expressive when they're hot. So, for example, in hot pot, you have this sort of layer of beef tallow or oil over the top. That oil does two things. On one hand, there are certain flavor compounds that are better carried through oil than water, right? Spices, for example. Imagine the best smelling thing in the world is probably garlic and butter, right? Or spices and onions in oil. And the same thing. This oil on top of the hot pot will carry those flavors that if it was cold, you wouldn't be able to perceive them. On the other hand, because oil and water don't sort of mix, you have this layer of oil that insulates the temperature of the pot, so you can cook things even more efficiently, and also the food can come out hotter. So Chinese food, unlike a lot of other cuisine, really, really needs its food to be really nice and fresh and hot.
I love that idea, and I can't wait till you bring it down to the Florida.
Yeah, well, we're not in the hot pot business, but as much as we love to eat hot pot, that's definitely something that we'd like to do in the
Yeah,
future.
I've had it before, but this was my first time having it in Tampa, so it was refreshing to see. There's a lot of diverse cuisines here, so
Hmm.
when you're ready, we'll help you make that transition. But speaking of the food needing to be hot, how are you managing the current times operating a restaurant with
Hmm.
COVID, where a lot of restaurants are using Uber Eats or DoorDash, where the food might not arrive as hot as it's supposed to be consumed? How are you managing that?
Yeah, so delivery is a huge part of our business, and to be honest, it always has been. We're lucky to be in the fast casual business because we're equipped to do delivery. So our restaurants have not closed since the pandemic, even in its worst times here in New York. But that doesn't mean that it didn't require a good amount of sort of like ingenuity and pivoting very quickly. Uh, we are all sort of immigrants, so from China. So we um, saw COVID-19. Sort of as devastating as it was for the economy, especially for the restaurant business, because our friends, our family, our peers, our investors, our partners are all in China. So I had actually just arrived back from Hong Kong in January, and remember hearing news about like the first case off of somebody who got off a plane from China into the U.S. And that's to say that we were all very sensitive and ready to move. We had prepared ourselves to pivot quickly by the time it got really bad. And so the good thing is we are very lucky to be savvy at delivery, whereas many other restaurants and other price points or they have other types of models weren't. Unfortunately, to this day, many of the third-party delivery platforms are pretty horrible for small businesses. They take a huge cut of the margins, and any sort of there's no federal help or like local or rather state level sort of mandates for these margins are unfortunately insufficient. So despite all of that, restaurants are kind of stuck in this hard place where you have to rely on them to get exposure. You have to rely on them because people like to stick to their platforms and their apps for ordering. But you try to you stick to those platforms until you can move your clients off of them. So that's the goal, hopefully. And there's a good amount of like, it's not that interesting to talk about, but ways to design your packaging, for example, to keep your food a little hotter, ways to design this flow of the kitchen space so that the food can arrive optimally to people. And we've done a lot of that sort of engineering. There's still a long ways to go. I think the restaurant industry is missing a lot of technology that we need, but we're doing our best.
Yeah,
Right now.
it sounds like you're doing it and pivoting, and it seems like this is for every business. You need to adapt or die and
Hmm.
pivot when the market calls for you to pivot.
Hmm.
And I like this idea also of the hustling. That's not just in the restaurant business. The fact that you were going around and rubbing elbows with some of the best in the game to give you some of those best practices you can learn from other food geniuses and
Yeah.
creators around the world and take those and apply them to your own restaurant, your own creations. It reminds me of Hero Dreams of Sushi,
Right.
the documentary. If you haven't seen it, it's
Yes.
amazing, about this guy who's
Yeah.
insanely obsessive about his craft.
Hmm.
So I love that you're taking that to the next level. And you know what the mayor of Tampa did, which I think is different than a lot of mayors of other cities. The reason we were allowed to stay open, like we have, is because she automatically assumed, and I don't know if this was just her sole decision, maybe someone on her team. They said, instead of shutting down, let's assume this is the new normal. And if you're a business right now, open up as if this is the new normal and you have to operate as is. So this was back, I think, in February or March.
Hmm.
And they closed down the restaurants and opened up the streets. So they closed them to traffic. So it was only allowing pedestrians and foot traffic,
Hmm.
and put picnic tables that were created by the city in the street and allowed the restaurants to serve their customers out in the street. So it closed
Hmm.
down all
Indoor dining. Yeah.
vehicle traffic, so that
Right.
way the restaurants could still stay open, just within a different way. And now since then we haven't had to close down the streets anymore. Now people are dining inside, and you just have to, every restaurant has the temperature
Mm-hmm.
gauge and the mask and whatnot, but then once you're inside, you can sit
Mm-hmm.
down and eat. But I think that's what allowed Tampa to stay open, where a lot of cities had to shut down. Most mayors said, let's just shut down and wait till things open back up and resume back to normal. And we're not resuming back to normal.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you are also kind of had that insight of, well, instead of just shutting down completely, let's see how we could operate with the current conditions.
Yeah. So the biggest thing we did when during the shutdown was we're actually copying what a lot of our good friends were doing, which was sending food to hospitals. Imagine the city shut down and New York has never been so empty. And everyone's locked down at home. And for whatever reason, people aren't ordering enough delivery to make up for the amount of food they were eating, even when they were eating in restaurants. So one of my good friends, his name is Eric C., and he was actually on the 30 under 30 list this year. And he was on there for no small part because he was one of the first in our community to say, I'm going to start taking in donations from mostly small, just individuals over the internet, all over the world. And I'm going to use that money to make food and just give it to hospitals to feed the front line. The reality was that in the beginning, these hospitals were flooded with workers because everyone's just trying to take care of people who were suddenly falling really sick really quickly. And in their busyness, they wouldn't really have good food or nutritious food to eat. They might be, ordering pizza or burgers or eating from the cafeteria, or they might just not be eating at all. So here we have a small business saying, I'm going to do what I can as a restaurant, as people who make food during the height of the pandemic. And we quickly followed suit and we said, hey, I want to do the same thing. In New York here, we have 3.5 restaurants. And our restaurants are equipped to make a large amount of food for vulnerable populations as well as for frontline workers. And we also, because of that scale, wanted to start doing things like setting up safe and scalable ways for hospitals to receive this food. We didn't perfectly know how COVID-19 was being transmitted. So we needed to make sure that we were giving food that was up to the hospital standards. So we started setting up systems with Weill Cornell, with NYU, with New York Presbyterian, and just like setting up all these programs so other restaurants can also start sending food in. And the great thing is, because people are donating and people are paying for these meals, that means we can keep our doors open, our restaurants can still be open, and our employees can continue to be paid. And that was really important to us since the get-go, is that we had 100-something people on staff. We didn't want to have to close our restaurants, and we didn't want our employees to lose their livelihood. And so we fought really hard, and we're very happy that to this day we haven't closed our doors a single day, and that our employees are still working. And
that's the Share a Meal. You call it the Share a Meal program.
That's the Share a Meal program, and we're bracing for perhaps another lockdown. So Share a Meal may very much be back in effect. Early when the pandemic started to die down a little bit here in New York City, we turned our focus towards other vulnerable populations like homeless, as well as sort of Black trans folks that really needed a lot of sort of food because, by virtue of not feeling safe going out, for example. We work with different organizations to keep using this money that was being donated in so that we could provide them food. From a culinary perspective, since I am a chef at the end of the day, it was just sort of wonderful that we were taking care of people and sending people food. And so happens it was Chinese food. It used to always be, burgers and pizza and salads, right? And suddenly it's just like sesame noodles and, tomato and egg noodles and stir fries and bean sprouts and all that stuff. And there's this moment in my head that I remember quite vividly. We were driving up to the Bronx and with 100 or something, 100, 200 meals in tow. And these nurses had come up to meet us. These nurses were from the Bronx. They're Black and they're brown. They're not the typical clientele for like fancy, like new age, modern Chinese vegetable food, right? And they're standing there and they're like, we've been so excited to get your food for so long. We had it last week and we're so excited that the hospital picked you guys to bring food to us again. And I was like, what in the world? Like these are not our regular customers, right? And they're just so happens to be excited about Northern Chinese home cooked vegetables. And it's great to feel like, that this food that is mostly eaten by white collar people in Midtown in New York, it has made its way like to different parts of the U.S., different parts of New York, and people are enjoying it, and it's keeping them fed to fight the good fight, and it's nourishing and all that stuff. And I think there was a lot to learn this year, and I'm very lucky that we were able to serve that food to good people.
You seem like a very kind, compassionate chef, which is not the stereotypical mindset I think of when I think of a chef. I mean, I've worked in restaurants since I was 11, as a server, paying my way through college and high school and whatnot. And I always picture the chefs that I worked with, which were like the Gordon Ramsays of the world, where they're just right in your face, yelling at you, calling you things you've never been called in your life.
Sure.
How did you learn how to become the leader that you are?
I mean,
today?
it doesn't take a young kid. You shouldn't take an outsider to look at that stuff and be like, this is not cool. Like, this is not cool. It's not effective, not efficient. Everybody I know, and I'm so lucky that I know so many people on the list this year in the food and drink category, but all of them are almost above all, they are so kind and compassionate and empathetic. They're well educated and they're intelligent, and they want to do something good for the community through this avenue of food. And at the end of the day, you meet enough good mentors that you realize shouting and screaming isn't the best way to communicate.
Unless you want a reality TV show. Like
unless you want a reality TV show. Exactly. That is a very old school way of running kitchens, which I'm sure worked for them. It just doesn't work for us anymore.
Understood. And I love your idea of just going out and training, learning, exploring from the best in the world. It reminds me of Jeff Henderson, is a Black chef from, forget where he's originally from, but I met him in person. He did a speech and he gave us a signed copy of his book. It was awesome. It's called Cooked. And he learned how to cook in prison and in California. And he's like with all these Italian mafia guys in prison, he said, and he's like cooking for these Italian guys who had a level of taste that he wasn't expecting. So he had to level up his culinary skills, and ended up working at like the Bellagio and all these Caesar's Palace, famous restaurants. And he would have this amazing executive chef position, great salary, great benefits, provided for his family. And then he would quit and go and work for another place where he had to start at the bottom and build himself up. And people were like, Jeff, you're crazy. Why would you give up this opportunity? You have a great salary, great benefits. And he said, because I'm not here to make a salary. I'm here to learn. I want to build my culinary skills from the best chefs in the world. And kind of like you, I'll scrub the dishes, I'll scrub the floors, I'll work for free just so you can gain a better acumen of your craft.
Yeah,
So
that's,
I love that.
In the culinary industry, we call it staging, which is the French word, but it's basically apprenticing. And I don't know how it ended up being that way, but it's baked into many young chefs' minds that this is the best way to get sort of get knowledge and get experience. You work for free or you work for very little in as many places as you can until you've gotten a good sense of cuisine and technique and how to run a restaurant, and you start doing it on your own. So one thing that's kind of interesting about the food world, or rather the restaurant industry, is that there's a certain degree of like go-getterness, like go-get-em kind of mentality, plus sort of like entrepreneurship already baked into very young, sort of the career trajectory of many of these young chefs. So we carry that with us today. I don't know if I can sort of like wholeheartedly recommend to everybody to work for free for as long as you can, because I certainly think that if you're producing food for a restaurant that's making money, you should be paid. But it was a very sort of formative way for me to start off when I didn't need to support myself because I was a student, So
apprenticeship, I think, could be applied to many different industries and many different career trajectories. Even if it's not for free, maybe it's a paid apprenticeship, but it seems like we've lost sight of that mentorship and apprenticeship approach to a lot of careers. Now it's typically, just go to college, study a textbook, and then you'll be prepared for the real world when you get out. And I don't think that's the case. And I think we're finding that this apprenticeship and mentorship is a better approach, or vocational type learning where you could learn from the best in the world, get a mentor, and see what it's actually like to work in that field. And maybe you find out, you know what, I'm not cut out for this, or this isn't my true passion. And I'm glad I got to see it firsthand before I invested $200,000 in student loans.
Sure.
Studying that.
Right. I mean, it applies to some industries, but more than others, especially vocational ones, as you say. If it's craft based, I remember talking to my hairdresser or my barbershop guy, and he was just like, I used to, try to work in Japanese salons and then Korean salons and Chinese salons, and just like try to get as much time as I could. I'd just bring my scissors with me when I was on vacation and see if I could like hang out. And it's like, yeah, people who cut hair, certainly, because it's very like technical, right? So places like that, or industries like that, I imagine that apprenticeship is really important. But sometimes I feel like a lot of our education system has deluded us with liberal arts programs to make everyone very, very sort of all-rounded or well-rounded, which has its benefits, but within certain industries, I think you definitely need to put your time in and get technical experience so that you can back up, your loftier visions for what you want to do.
Sure, absolutely. And thinking about your success and getting you to where you are now, what do you think was the single most important attribute you had personally that got you to where you are today?
Good question. My instinct is probably something to do with sort of curiosity. I remember just growing up in Hong Kong, and like every other Hong Konger, we love to eat. But my mom and my dad were very keen on reinforcing this idea that if you ate 3 times a day, at least 21 times a week, you really should be paying attention to the food. You should be asking yourself, do you like it? And then you should ask yourself, like, what do you like about it? What do you not like about it? Why is that the case? Where did this food come from? Who cooked it? How am I being served it? And just being very sort of attentive and having sort of attention to detail and just like interacting in a lively and honest way with this thing that you do 3 times a day.
And what is it doing to your body that you're doing 21 times a week to your body?
Exactly. From a nutrition perspective, to a historical perspective, to, in Hong Kong, we have a pretty interesting and unique history with regard to being a British colony, but also like a huge part of China that's like actually has a very young history and all this stuff. And, you can start thinking about history. You can access conversations about colonialism through Hong Kong food. And so that's a lot of my approach to my cuisine and the type of businesses that I'd like to open, because I love to think of food as a gateway into a larger conversation about other things. It's a really great way to start conversations about culture, but it's also a great way to start talking about, health and wellness and being happy and whatever it is. And it so happens that food, especially Chinese food, is my lens through which to see most of the world. So I'm excited to share that with people. And I think that's maybe like the main motivating factor.
Curiosity, it's important. And for a while, I was all about efficiency. Like, how can I be the absolute most productive, most efficient, most effective? And my friends used to joke like, Phil, soon we're just going to slide a pill for you to take through an eye slot in your door.
Yeah.
So you don't even have to waste time eating. That's how I used to look at it. And then I realized food is so much more than just the nutrition. It's about the emotional feel that you have, the connection you have with other people, the relationships that you build over an enjoyable meal. And so it's changed my mindset a little bit. And it's because I think of the people that put so much time, effort, and energy into their craft like you.
Yeah. I mean, hey, I also would want to, advocate for people not caring about food if they don't care about it. There's this like rampant foodieism, especially in the US and the internet, where everyone's kind of obsessed with food. But I also do want to put it out there that as a chef, you can hear from me first, like, if you don't like food, you don't need to like food. If you want to soylent it for the rest of your life, go ahead. Whatever works for you, it's just, again, it's my personal way to approach learning about the world, but there are other ways to do it too.
Find out what works for you.
Yeah.
On the flip side, we talked about your success. What's been the biggest lesson you've learned during your journey that maybe you had wished you had learned from sooner?
I don't know what the biggest one is. I can think of so many mistakes, but I would say that a lot of my biggest, a lot of Junzi's greatest successes were born out of mistakes, and mistakes in terms of our assumptions about things. For example, we were very committed early on to, and this is sort of minute, but we were sort of committed very early on saying something different about Chinese food. And most people think Chinese food is all about rice. So we said we're not going to serve rice in our restaurant because the real core grain of Chinese cooking is actually flour, and flour becomes dumplings, obviously, but flour also becomes flatbread, or what we call bings, like wraps and stuff. It becomes noodles. It's this like very important sort of grain that sometimes is forgotten when we talk about Chinese food. And so we said no rice from a sort of ideological sort of standpoint. And it took us 3 or 4 years before we started putting rice on the menu, and we sell more rice now than anything else on the menu. I always thought that I needed to teach people how to pronounce certain ingredients, and we needed to put more Chinese words on there. That was also sort of incorrect because people just couldn't remember them. So I had all these assumptions about like what people knew and didn't know about Chinese food, and how to elaborate on our mission via these like little details here and there. And most of these assumptions that we had going on were totally wrong.
And you learned to prove them false or true by your experience, by experimenting and trying it.
Exactly. And not only experimenting it, but finding a quantifiable way to measure the results. So we are very committed as a company to business intelligence and data analytics, and trying to find sort of quantifiable, sort of objective ways to gauge hypotheses of ours. Our founder, our CEO and founder Yang was an environmental scientist. I'm a cognitive scientist before I was a chef. So all of it points towards like finding a good way to like asking curious, good questions, going ahead and testing it relentlessly, and also just finding the right metrics to gauge whether you were right in the first place, whether it was the right question to ask, or whether the answer is what you expected. And I think that in some ways is kind of interesting for a food company, because most food companies or restaurants are more mom and pop and sort of down to earth or something, and it's very sort of like subjective. But I think embracing that type of this mode of knowledge of like curious out there questions with quantifiable results that you can analyze and look at, that's been a huge part of our growth since 4 or 5 years ago.
Love that. You backed it with data and evidence to support your claims. Or speaking about your business intelligence, what's been the most popular dish that consumers buy from you?
So at Junzi Kitchen, we sell a lot of firecracker chicken rice bowls, which are sort of like mildly spicy and sweet kind of chicken bowls with rice and cabbage and stuff. It's really delicious. But at Nice Day Chinese, I sell so much General Tso's chicken, like so much General Tso's chicken. It's like by far the most popular thing on our menu. We were lucky because when the first week we opened, the head food critic of Eater came by and didn't tell anybody who was here, and just bought this chicken, maybe delivery, and said, "Oh, this is one of the best fried chickens in the world." I mean, in New York. And we're like, wait a minute. General Tso's, we never knew General Tso's chicken qualifies as fried chicken, but technically, yes, it's chicken that's fried. And on top of that, we spent a long time looking at different recipes, looking at what different Chinese American restaurants were. We ate so much General Tso's chicken from everybody else to figure out what was in it, and then we decided on our formula, and then put that out there. So that's General Tso's chicken, since we opened like 2-3 months ago, has been a big hit.
What would you have guessed would have been the biggest before you had even?
So my favorite thing on our menu at Nice Day Chinese is chicken chow mein, or shrimp chow mein, or like chow mein. And chow mein is a Cantonese style stir-fried noodle. So it's very light and bouncy. It's what I used to eat at dim sum, when I was a kid. And it is our worst seller. It is the least, like nobody eats it enough. And I think it's so good. And actually, most of my staff think the chow mein is the best fried noodle we have on there. And we know why it doesn't sell well, because people don't really know what it is. They confuse chow mein with lo mein. Most people like thick noodles rather than thin noodles. And that's actually in almost every type of noodle culture, right? For pasta. fettuccine is more attractive when you're picking fettuccine rather than like angel hair, for example. And it's the same for Xi'an types of noodles. Like people want pulled thick noodles instead of like thin noodles. It's just this, I don't know. But for everyone who's listening in New York who hasn't ordered from us yet, you guys need to be eating more chow mein because it's so freaking good.
It sounds like it. I'm getting hungry just thinking about it.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a story. One of my co-founders, when we first started out, we were trying to expose him to Thai food. Mm-hmm. And, he's a typical like white American and hadn't traveled as much. And he went into a Thai food restaurant. We brought him in and we're trying to explain pad Thai. And this is one of the most popular dishes that people order. And he wasn't getting it for some reason. So waitress still trying to explain it and he wasn't getting it. So we finally just show him a picture of one of their dishes and he's like, oh, it's like fucking spaghetti.
Yeah. The crazy thing about pad Thai, and one of my favorite things about the pad Thai is that pad Thai is actually a dish that was invented by the Thai government to further people's understanding of Thailand, because there's a lot of Thai food that comes before pad Thai. Pad Thai is a recent invention, and it wasn't like, oh, people started adding this to this and it became this. It wasn't like happenstance. It was like invented. They were like, we need to make a dish that will make people like this country a lot and love the people and love the culture. And they like made pad Thai, which is a lot sweeter, right, than a lot of Thai food out there. It's like savory. A lot of people end up putting ketchup in it for whatever reason, and it's got like this like cool pink hue. It's just like it's an engineered dish for a cultural purpose, and it's a form of gastro diplomacy. So it's really interesting from a historical perspective.
Well, it worked.
Thai. Yeah, and it's popular outside of Thailand. It is popular inside of Thailand now. And yeah, it worked. It's a really great ambassador for, what Thai food is kind of like for people who haven't had it before.
And I think that's a good learning lesson for everyone, which is people learn things and probably from your cognitive science background, you've preached this too, I'm sure. People understand new things better when they can relate it to something they already know. Like for him, it was pad Thai relates, it's like spaghetti. So he's more open to trying it because he can think of something it reminds him of that he's comfortable with, he's familiar with. So what other ways in our business maybe or our craft can we help our audience, our consumers, if we do have to do that consumer education portion, what could we relate it to that they might already know or be familiar with so it's easier for them to digest or adopt?
It's a process of translation, right? And so, I spent a lot of time in the English department in college thinking about translation. And the cool thing about translation is that the best translators, let's say, for example, that you're translating from French to English. The best translators aren't the best French speakers. They're the best English speakers. They're people who are masters at expressing themselves in the target language that you're translating something into, not the language that you're translating from. So in terms of this, right, it's like the key is to understand, that your friend's vocabulary is about spaghetti more so than trying to understand what pad Thai is. And like when you learn that empathy and you learn to put yourself in that person's shoes, and that's the customer experience. You imagine yourself, you're walking into a restaurant for the first time, and like you have to like think as them more so than you should think as a person making the food, and that's also a big learning.
So we need to find out what your chow mein needs to be called for people to easily adopt it.
Yeah, maybe just like bouncy angel hair or something. But I
love angel hair. So.
Yeah, and you don't want it to sound stupid. You don't want to end up sort of like condescending to yourself.
Sure, of course. And you don't want to dilute the historical nature of it. But I do find that some menus, if they are very, let's say, Italian sounding, and maybe you don't understand what it's saying, they'll have like a mini description under it to kind of explain in a one-liner, like this is what we are.
Yeah.
Thinking about this hustle and adapting the business to different needs and different consumers, what's something scrappy you did to hustle that maybe you couldn't have revealed when you were first starting out, but you're willing to share now?
I wish I had an amazing story like the Airbnb sort of like serial that I wish I had an amazing story like that, but I don't really. The scrappiest thing was opening these restaurants in dorm rooms on hot plates. And the busiest night we did when I was like a senior, so we did 250 people over a weekend in dorm rooms. It was insane. But it was what you had to do because that's the space that you had. You're like, hey, we're going to start serving ramen, so I guess we should buy bowls. We should learn how to make it. It's just like every very, very step by step, and just doing things sort of just why not? Just try it out, see what resonates, and then be quick to abandon something that doesn't work, or just be careful about like improving it so that it does work. That type of like sort of like relentless sort of just go for it. Let's just go for it. It was really, really important to us early on. Of course, that mindset doesn't always apply forever. There are costs to trying something out that doesn't have a good rate or likelihood of success. But that early on, that was very much our mentality was, hey, let's just open restaurants and dorms and see what happens and see if people like this food. And hopefully it'll build some sort of camaraderie or at least like buzz around what we're doing here.
It's like following the design thinking approach from Stanford D School or the lean startup method, where you're just constantly iterating, testing out MVP, iterate. Yeah. And I just heard about my buddy went to LA and the restaurants were closed down, but they had an outdoor like picnic table. And he noticed there's 5 iPads on the table. And he goes and he was just grabbing a cup of coffee from this place. And he asked him, what are these iPads about? He said, each one is a separate Uber Eats business that he set up, but he operates them out of his same kitchen. So he has one kitchen, but he has 5 different brands all operating out. So he's like, one is a lunch, sandwich type deli restaurant. One is desserts, one is breakfast foods, but he cooks from the same kitchen, just pretends that they're all 5 separate brands because everyone was using the Uber Eats app rather than physically going to the restaurants.
Yeah. I mean, that's a service that, there are third-party services that come in and look at your inventory at your restaurant and tell you, you know what, you could be opening a panini restaurant and this is how you would do it. I can put everything together for you within a week or two and you can open a panini restaurant in the same space. That type of innovation is really cool. I think it's a lot of it we should be copying a lot of this from China and from India, because they are leagues ahead of us in terms of delivery, like effective, efficient, and cheap delivery that makes sense for the businesses. The market obviously is a little different, but a lot of these good ideas are happening in places with a more robust sort of like internet economy. So I think it's, I'd always encourage especially people in the food business to look across to other countries to see what other people are doing, especially during a time like COVID when they've already gone through it, look at their data, try to learn as much as you can from over there and bring it over to wherever you are.
Yeah, and it seems like that works for really convenient, fast casual type restaurants, takeout, delivery. But after this, it seems like if you don't fall into that category, it's really going to be about creating experiences, creating a dining experience that you can't get from just ordering online or via Uber. And if you see with Amazon, it's putting a lot of retail out of business because of the convenience of not having to go to the store. Well, the stores that are surviving are the ones that create an experience in person for when you go there. It's different than what you could ever experience online. I remember Gary Vee was talking about this regarding Toys R Us. He goes, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 for bankruptcy because they could buy the toys online. And when you go into Toys R Us, what's the first thing they tell the kids to do? The kid wants to play with the toy. They tell them, oh, sorry, you can't play with that. And he said that's the exact opposite approach they should be taking. They should open that place up to be a playhouse, a playground for children to experience all these toys and play with them. And that way, once they play with it, what's the kid going to do? Mommy, daddy, can I have this toy? It's going to be a gem in that regard. And I think the new owners are trying to take over and repurpose it for that fashion. But I think it's not just a lesson for Toys R Us, but all restaurants and businesses that could offer an experience for consumers to attend and experience in real life rather than virtually.
Yeah.
So Lucas, we're going to conclude now and transition into something I like to call the under 30 seconds round.
Sure.
Where you're going to answer with the first thing that comes to mind as fast as you can, as soon as I ask the question. Ready?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. What is the book you've gifted more often than any other book and why?
I've given out a lot of Lydia Davis books. Lydia Davis is a short story writer with an immense, like she packs an immense amount of meaning in a very, very short, sort of very, very, very short, like 1 to 2 sentence stories often. And it's a great template for brevity, but also how to adapt sort of our understanding of big, meaningful literature into very small spaces, which is honestly how a lot of information is communicated today.
Yeah, it seems like Twitter kind of forced people to do that. So maybe if
Yeah.
you're having trouble coming up with your Twitter one-liners, this will be a good book
Yeah.
to help. What's one of the books you'd recommend from her?
Any of her short story collections. There are multiple. There's one, I think it's called like Can't Stop, Won't Stop or something like that.
Okay,
But any of the collections are good.
perfect. What's one of the best investments and one of the worst investments you've ever made, and why?
Um, Early on in this pandemic, I invested in rubber bands, or what are they called? Elastic bands for workouts at home, which is so hugely important. I usually go to the gym every morning, and having that taken away from me was so difficult in the beginning of the pandemic. So if all of you are stuck at home, resistance bands that you can hinge onto doors and things are a huge help, and you can actually get a really big lift in and hit all sorts of ankles and that sort of thing. But so that was really fun. That's one of the best. One of the worst investments might be a standalone air fryer. Air fryers are pretty silly. If you have an oven or a toaster oven, that works too. But yeah, standalone air fryers that don't have any single purpose kitchen tool is generally pretty stupid.
What's the most impactful thing you do in your morning routine and the most impactful thing you do in your evening routine?
I don't have a morning routine or an evening routine. I like wake up and I fall asleep. But recently, we bought a coffee machine that has an automatic little brew light, and we use that and we keep it next to the bed, like on the floor. And that coffee machine wakes us up better than an alarm does, because then you hear it dripping and being annoying, and then you like smell the coffee and stuff. And
Oh wow, it starts you don't even have to hit anything. It's already
you program it the night before, put the ground like you wake up, you just roll to the side, you like slug a cup of coffee and you're ready to go.
Wow. Excellent. Well, pretend you won the Peter Thiel Fellowship and you were going to get money to start a business instead of go to college. What's the very first thing you do to start your new business?
Convince people to go to good colleges, maybe. I don't know about this fellowship. I am a huge proponent of going to school if you have the curiosity and the means to do so. I had a really good time in college, and I read very widely that I believe made me into a more curious and sort of like empathetic human being that I wouldn't pass up for in the world. I would maybe invest time in trying to build some sort of real life experience. As you mentioned with Toys R Us, I think there's nothing that, there's no substitute for being able to serve somebody an experience and like seeing how they react. And so, doing the restaurants in the dorms, that's exactly what we did, was that we could get people together and show people that we were making food and try to generate sort of a nice communal space.
Love it. Last one. What's something you never knew you needed?
4 different ways of making coffee. We have an espresso machine, we have a drip, AeroPress, we have the regular drip as well. It's just, we drink so much coffee, especially in the business.
Sounds like it.
That, you want a little bit of variance, and it's cool to be able to have something that is so singular, right? It's just coffee, but just by the way you grind it and the different ways you brew it, different temperatures and pressures, it's fun to have something, to have control over coffee. And I certainly try not to pay for coffee because it's really, really expensive.
Have you ever had an affogato? That's my favorite.
I mean, an affogato is an excuse for coffee because it's pure syrup. So, but
if we're being honest, But when you come visit in Tampa, I'll have to take you to a great place that has an affogato.
It's like that's like calling a root beer float like a soda. It's just like, sure, technically sort of is, but it's mostly ice cream.
It's a little hidden gem. Not many people know about it, but
right.
Well, Lucas, thank you so much for being here today. Before you go, what's next for you? What's the next big goal, milestone, or bucket list item you want to achieve?
Well, we'll be lucky if we make it to the top of next year. But we are opening new Nice Day Chinese locations. Hopefully, we can start really getting into our mission of trying to help out some of these old Chinese American restaurants that are closing by virtue of the pandemic or racism or just the decline of Chinese food in the US. So hopefully we get to sort of work with the community in a more in-depth way and build these new sort of Nice Day Chinese locations. That'll be good for the US. Yeah.
Where do listeners go to connect with you?
So the best place to come hang out is probably on my Instagram. My Instagram is at Lucas, Lucas.sin. That's my personal Instagram, and our restaurant's Instagram is Junzi Kitchen, JunziKitchen.
Junzi. And also you do a chef study on your Instagram live account, right?
Well, I haven't done that for a while. The last one was in August or so, but we've been doing this during the pandemic. And I'm sure that if we lock down again, everyone can take a chance and take a look at chef study.
Well, please go connect with Lucas and Junzi Kitchen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today. This is Lucas Sin, who provides you with the best food you need to check out in New York and New Haven. At Junzi Kitchen. We learned so much here today. We learned how to adapt and pivot to the market, how to hustle and learn from the best in the world, while also using a scientific approach to your curiosity. Lucas, thank you again so much for being here today. It's such a pleasure.
No worries. Thank you, Phil.
I hope this episode helped you as much as it helped me. Have an amazing day.
Thanks for joining us today. I hope this episode helped you as much as it helped me. Who do you think would benefit from hearing it? You can make an impact on their life by sharing it now. Before you go, I encourage you to tell us your favorite part of the episode in the review section. Now it's time to level up. Level up.